So, my name's Abby, for those who don't know me. I've been coming to Ivy for about 6 years, but in that time, I've never actually stood up and given my testimony, so I thought this would be a really good opportunity to do that, or give you a tiny little chunk of it. So, I grew up in a Christian family. I went to a Christian church, and it was a good upbringing, but the church it had a lot of rules, and I remember being young and thinking that being a Christian was about following the rules. And when I went to university, that was my first opportunity to kind of live without the rules and work out what my faith meant to me, really. And over a series of kind of bad decisions and hanging around with the wrong people, I ended up becoming a person that I didn't really like. And if you'd asked me at the time, are you a Christian? I would have said yeah, but I definitely wasn't living like a Christian. And I didn't really like myself very much. I just got to a place where I was a bit lost. I didn't really know why I was living. So it was pretty dark. And at the time, my mum used to nag me all the time, and she'd say, you need to go back to church. I've been listening to these podcasts online, and it's from a church called Ivy. It's just down the road. Just go to make me happy. So basically, just to shut her up. Sorry, Mum, if you're listening to this. I decided to go. So I arranged to meet up with one of my friends who also didn't go to church at the time, and we said that we'd go down that evening together. And then at the last minute, she pulled out, and I remember thinking, right, that's it, not a chance. I am not going on my own. I'm putting my pyjamas back on. I'm getting back into bed because I'm a student, so that's what we do. And I remember lying in bed and looking at the wall and really clearly hearing God say to me, if you go on your own tonight, I will reward you. And it was just a voice in my head, but I remember thinking, it feels important. So shaking and really upset, I put my clothes back on, walked down Palatine Road, and came here one dark night. And as soon as I walked into the evening service at Ivy, I just felt like something clicked and like it was home. And over a journey over the next kind of couple of weeks and months, I found my way back to God again and found my faith. And now my life is completely changed because of that one tiny moment of listening to God. Also, on that night, I did go to the pub after church, and there was a tall, handsome stranger who sat next to me, and he bought me a drink, and long story short, I ended up marrying him. So he likes to think he's part of the reward. So that's just a little bit about my testimony, and I feel like it's a good example of tiny actions leading to life-changing consequences. If I hadn't listened to God in that very small moment, then my whole life right now would be completely different, and I don't even like to think about what it could have been. It's not always the big stresses which are life-changing. When I was younger, I used to be obsessed with exams. I used to think, my GCSEs, my A-levels, that is how I changed my life. If I don't get A stars all across the board, I won't get a good job, my life will be miserable. So that's what I hinged everything on. And they are important, but often it's not those massive things that you think change your life as much as you think they will. Often it's the really small decisions, the times where you decide to listen to God, the times where you decide to talk to that person that you feel like you should talk to. So I'm going to be talking today about a woman in the Bible who made a tiny, life-changing decision. And that's in Luke 8:42 to 48. So I'll read it out for you. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, and no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that the power has gone out from me. And then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she'd been instantly healed. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. So being a medic, when I first read this passage, I wanted to find out what the issue of bleeding was. So a good internet search later, it seems that most scholars would agree that it was probably a problem with her menstruation. If there are any men listening to this, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about periods. It's a fact of life. We have to deal with it, so do you. So the word issue could also be translated as discharge. So it's probably likely that she had been bleeding, so she'd had a period for 12 years. Possibly the whole time, maybe very heavy, maybe intermittently. But if we were thinking about that in the context of today, we'd call it menorrhagia or intermenstrual bleeding. And that, in the context of today, would be really worrying. If a woman came to me and said that she had those symptoms, I'd be thinking about things like endometriosis and fibroids and even cancer. So if we take this woman into today's terms, it's worrying enough with the symptoms that she presents with. Nowadays, it would mean panic. Back then, however, if you think about, they would have no sanitary products, no washing facilities, no toilet paper. Practically, this would be awful. It'd be a terrible thing to go through. And then there's another layer on top of it. So there's the religious context of the day. This lady was unclean. In Leviticus, it tells us about the laws regarding a woman when she's on her monthly period. And it says things like, when a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity will last 7 days. Anyone touches her will be unclean. Anything she lies on is unclean. Anything she sits on will be unclean. Anybody who touches the thing she has lied on or sat on will be unclean. So this is a woman who, for 12 years, hasn't been able to touch her family without making them unclean, hasn't been able to touch her friends without making them unclean. So she's not only had that physical illness, she's also had that emotional burden and that feeling of being an outcast from society for 12 years. That is a long time. Sometimes I have patients in A&E who are grumpy because their antibiotics haven't worked after 4 days. So this woman was invisible to society, but she wasn't invisible to Jesus. He could have ignored her touch and let her go on her way, healed, but he didn't. He stopped everything to show her that he could see her, and he cares about her. To show her that she is important. She's not invisible to Jesus, even if she's invisible to everybody else. Also, he was on his way to do a task for the most important man in town, Jairus' father. We don't know his name, but it was important. Jesus was on the way to heal Jairus' daughter. And pushing through the crowds meant that she'd had to take a huge risk to touch all the people around. So I tried to think about what that would be like now, and it's kind of like if you went through a really crowded concert covered in sewage. That's probably the sort of reaction that she would have got from people at the time. She was disgusting, she was unclean, and so to get to Jesus, she had to put herself through the shame of this, pushing through the people and touching the people that she shouldn't have been touching, and interrupting important men. What drove her? She was desperate, and Jesus brought hope. All it took was a simple act of desperate faith, and Jesus singled her out and spoke to her directly. He knew her, and he called her his daughter. It wasn't the physical touch that healed. So verse 48 says, Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." It wasn't the physical touch, it was the simple act. In desperation and in hope, that's what bridged the gap between the woman and Jesus. And it was that which healed her and made her whole. We don't have Jesus' robes to cling to today, but we do have Jesus himself. And we can still make the choice to reach out in desperation and hope, if need be, to him. Nothing fancy is needed, just an outstretched hand. This lady didn't have any fancy prayers or fancy petitions. She didn't know what she was doing. She just acted in faith. For me, it was getting out of my pajamas, taking off my slippers, and walking into Ivy alone. This one act changed my life forever. What is your life-changing story? I know a lot of people have a story about how they came to Jesus and their whole life was changed amazingly after that. But if you're at that place, what will your next story be? What will you do when you hear God speak to you? Will you do that strange thing that he's asking you to do and step out? Or will you decide to not make the tiny decision or wait for the big ones to come along? And it's not the big ones that change anything. And if you don't have a moment where you accepted Jesus into your life and you reached out your hand for him, maybe today could be that moment for you. Today could be the moment where you can come back home to Jesus, the one who knows you, he loves you, he died for you, and he calls you his son or daughter. Don't go home today without making that tiny life-changing decision. And maybe today will be the day that everything changes for you. Thank you.